My name is Marcus Delaney. I am 67 years old, born and raised right here in West Feliciana Parish, Louisiana. Most folks around these parts know me as the man who worked 38 years at the Riverside Lumber Mill, the one who never missed a Sunday at First Baptist Church, and the fellow who keeps the prettiest peach orchard this side of the Mississippi River. But there is something else they know about me, something that has followed me like a shadow for over 20 years now. They know I am the man whose own sister took him to court, the man who stood in front of a judge while his flesh and blood called him a thief, the man who has not spoken to Louise Marie Delaney since 1989. That land we fought over was not just any piece of property. It was 143 acres of Louisiana soil that my daddy, James Robert Delaney, worked with his bare hands for 42 years. It was the land where my mama, Ruth Elizabeth, planted her vegetable garden every spring and canned peaches every summer until the day she died. It was the land where Louise and I learned to walk, learned to work, learned what it meant to be family. I never thought family could end in a courtroom. Never thought I would sit across from my baby sister while lawyers argued over what our parents meant when they left us that land. Never thought I would hear Louise tell a judge that I had stolen from her, that I had manipulated our dying father, that I was nothing but a greedy older brother who took advantage of a grieving family. The judge ruled in my favor. The will was clear, the witnesses were honest, and the law was on my side. But when I walked out of that courthouse in St. Francisville, I knew I had lost something worth more than any piece of property. I had lost my sister, and she had lost her brother. People ask me sometimes if I regret fighting for that land. They want to know if keeping those acres was worth losing Louise. They expect me to say it was not worth it, that family matters more than property, that I should have just given her what she wanted to keep the peace. But the truth is more complicated than that. You see, it was never really about the land. It was about respect. It was about honesty. It was about looking your family in the eye and telling the truth, even when the truth is hard to hear. When Louise stood up in that courtroom and called me a thief, she was not just talking about property. She was talking about the kind of man I am. She was saying I was the type of person who would cheat his own sister, who would take advantage of grief and loss for personal gain. I am not that kind of man. I never was. And I could not let those words stand without a fight, even if fighting meant losing her forever. For 20 years I have lived with that choice. 20 years of empty chairs at Christmas dinner, 20 years of birthdays that passed without phone calls, 20 years of seeing Louise's friends around town and having them look away, not knowing what to say to the man who took his sister to court. I kept working. I kept going to church. I kept tending to that land like it was a sacred trust, because that is what it was. Every morning I would walk those acres and remember my father's hands in the soil, my mother's voice calling us in for supper. Every evening I would sit on the porch and listen to the crickets sing, knowing that somewhere across town my sister was listening to the same sound. But we were not listening together anymore. The thing about family disputes is that they change you in ways you do not expect. They make you question things you thought you knew for certain. They make you wonder if the people you grew up with ever really knew you at all. They make you realize that love and trust are not the same thing, and that sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who know exactly where to aim. I learned to live with the quiet. I learned to find peace in my work, in my faith, in the simple rhythm of seasons changing over land that had seen generations of Delaneys come and go. I told myself that some wounds are too deep to heal, that some words cannot be taken back, that some choices echo for the rest of your life. I was wrong about that last part. 20 years after that courthouse door closed behind us, Louise came back into my life. Not with an apology, not with an explanation, not with any attempt to make things right between us. She came back because she was dying, and I was the only person on earth who could save her life. This is the story of what happened when my sister needed a kidney, and I was the only match. This is the story of how 20 years of silence can be broken by a single, desperate phone call. This is the story of what it means to choose between justice and mercy, between the hurt in your heart and the blood that runs through your veins. This is the story of how I learned that forgiveness does not mean forgetting. and that sometimes the hardest person to save is the one who hurt you the most. Before I tell you about the worst day of my life, let me tell you about the best years. Let me tell you about what we were before lawyers and judges and broken promises changed everything. Growing up on that land in West Feliciana Parish was like living in a world that moved slower and felt safer than anywhere else on earth. Our house sat on a small rise overlooking fields that stretched as far as a child's eye could see, with Mama's peach trees lining the front yard like sentries guarding our little piece of heaven. Louise was 4 years younger than me, born when I was old enough to understand that this tiny, red-faced baby was going to change everything. And she did. From the moment she could walk, she followed me everywhere. When I went to check on Daddy's cattle, Louise was right behind me, her little legs working twice as hard to keep up. When I helped Mama with the canning, Louise stood on a wooden stool next to me, her hands sticky with peach juice and her face serious with concentration. We were what folks around here call close-knit. Every morning started with Mama's biscuits and Daddy reading from his worn leather Bible before we headed out to do our chores. Every evening ended with all 4 of us on the front porch, Daddy playing his harmonica, while Mama mended clothes and Louise and I caught fireflies in mason jars. Daddy was the kind of man they do not make anymore. James Robert Delaney stood 6 feet tall and had hands like leather from 40 years of working this land. He could fix anything that broke, build anything that needed building, and had never told a lie in his life. He taught me that a man's word was his bond, that hard work never killed anybody, and that family was the most important thing God ever gave us. Mama was the heart of our home. Ruth Elizabeth had a way of making everyone feel welcome at her table and loved in her house. She could stretch a dollar until it screamed, turn leftovers into a feast, and somehow always know exactly what you needed to hear when life got hard. She taught Louise and me that taking care of each other was not just something you did when it was convenient, but something you did especially when it was not. Louise and I learned to work side by side from the time we could walk. We fed chickens together, gathered eggs together, helped Daddy repair fences and harvest crops together. When Louise was scared of the dark, I would walk her to the outhouse after supper. When I broke my arm falling out of the old oak tree, Louise sat by my bed reading to me until the cast came off. We had our fights, of course. What brothers and sisters do not? Louise thought she was too grown up to take direction from her big brother, and I thought she was too young to have opinions about anything important. She would get mad and refuse to speak to me for hours, which would drive me crazy because I was used to having her around all the time. But by bedtime, one of us would always give in, and we would be back to being a team again. Sundays were special in the Delaney house. We would dress in our best clothes and drive to First Baptist Church in St. Francisville, where 3 generations of our family had worshipped. After service, we would come home to Mama's fried chicken and spend the afternoon visiting with neighbors or taking long walks around the property. Louise loved those Sunday walks. She would pick wildflowers and weave them into chains, chattering about everything and nothing while Daddy pointed out different birds and taught us the names of trees. In the summer, we would have family reunions that brought cousins and aunts and uncles from all over Louisiana. The house would fill with laughter and the smell of good food, and Louise and I would run wild with our cousins until we were so tired we could barely keep our eyes open. Those were the days when our land felt like the center of the universe, when family felt like something permanent and unbreakable. When I think back on those years, I remember the sound of Louise's laugh echoing across the fields when I would chase her through the tall grass. I remember the way she would hold my hand during thunderstorms, and the way she would save half her dessert for me when I was working late with Daddy. I remember the way we would make plans for the future, talking about how we would both stay close to home, how our children would grow up together on this same land, how nothing would ever change the bond between us. We trusted each other completely back then. If Louise said she would meet me by the creek after chores, I knew she would be there. If I promised to help her with something, she knew I would keep my word. We had never given each other reason to doubt, never had cause to question each other's motives or intentions. That trust felt as natural as breathing. It never occurred to me that it was something fragile, something that could be broken by harsh words or hurt feelings or the complicated business of money and property. It never occurred to me that the little girl who used to fall asleep holding my hand might one day look me in the eye and call me a thief. But time changes people in ways you cannot always see coming. Life gets complicated. Children grow up and move away and start seeing the world through different eyes. And sometimes, the family that raised you starts to feel like a burden instead of a blessing. I should have seen it coming. Maybe I did see it, but I did not want to believe it was happening. Because when you love someone the way I loved Louise, you want to believe that love is stronger than everything else. You want to believe that family means something that cannot be broken. I was wrong about that too. The first crack in our family foundation came when Louise turned 18 and started spending time in Baton Rouge. She had gotten a job at a department store downtown, and suddenly our little world in West Feliciana Parish was not big enough for her anymore. I should have seen it as natural growing up. Young people leave home, find their own way, discover who they are outside of their family's shadow. But Louise's leaving felt different somehow. It was not just that she was spending less time at home. It was that when she was home, she seemed to be somewhere else entirely. She would come back from Baton Rouge talking about people I had never met, using words that sounded foreign in our kitchen. She started questioning things that had never been questioned before. Why did we go to the same church every Sunday? Why did we always eat supper at the same time? Why did Daddy insist on reading the Bible every morning when there were so many other things we could be doing with that time? At first, Mama and Daddy just smiled and said Louise was finding herself. Young people ask questions, they said. It is part of growing up. But I could see the worry creeping into Mama's eyes when Louise would roll hers during Daddy's Bible reading, or when she would make little comments about how backward our ways seemed compared to life in the city. The changes were small at first. Louise started coming home later and later from her job in Baton Rouge, claiming she had to work overtime or that she was spending time with friends. She would miss family meals and then act annoyed when Mama saved her a plate. She began talking about our neighbors like they were simple people who did not understand the real world. I tried to talk to her about it once, when we were alone in the barn feeding the horses. I asked her if everything was all right, if she was happy with her job, if there was something bothering her about home. Louise looked at me like I had asked her to explain calculus to a child. "Marcus, you would not understand," she said, brushing past me to hang up the feed bucket. "You have never been anywhere except this farm and that lumber mill. You do not know what it is like out there in the real world." That stung more than I expected it to. I had never thought of my life as small or limited. I had a good job, a loving family, land that had been in our family for generations. I had roots and purpose and people who counted on me. But Louise made it sound like I was trapped, like I was too afraid or too simple to want anything more. The real trouble started after Daddy got sick. It was the spring of 1987, and Daddy had been having chest pains that he kept trying to ignore. Mama finally made him go to the doctor, and they found blockages in his heart that required surgery. It was serious business. And for the first time in my life, I saw my father look vulnerable. During those weeks when Daddy was in the hospital, I took over everything on the farm. I got up before dawn to handle the chores, worked my shift at the lumber mill, and then came home to take care of whatever needed doing until dark. It was exhausting, but it felt right. This was my family's land, my father's legacy, and I was going to make sure it was still here when he got well. Louise came home during Daddy's surgery, and for a few days it felt like old times. She helped Mama with the cooking and cleaning, sat with us in the hospital waiting room, and even joined in when we took turns reading to Daddy during his recovery. But as soon as Daddy started feeling better, Louise began talking about fairness again. "Marcus, you know Daddy is going to expect you to take over everything now," she said one evening when we were sitting on the porch after visiting hours. "But this land belongs to both of us. When the time comes, we should both have equal say in what happens to it." I did not know what to say to that. It had never occurred to me that there would be any question about who would take care of the farm. I was the one who had always worked it alongside Daddy. I was the one who knew every fence post and every season's rhythm. I was the one who had never wanted to be anywhere else. But Louise was right about one thing. The land would legally belong to both of us someday. Daddy had always made it clear that everything would be split evenly between his children, just like his daddy had done before him. I just assumed that meant I would manage the property, and Louise would get her fair share of any income it produced. Louise, you know I would never cheat you out of anything, I told her. This land will always be yours too, but somebody has to actually work it. Somebody has to live here and take care of it every day. That is what I am talking about, Marcus. You just assume it will be you. You assume I will be happy to let you make all the decisions and then maybe get a check once in a while if there is any money left over. That is not fair, and it is not right. I could hear something in her voice that I had never heard before. It was not just disagreement or frustration, it was suspicion. Like she thought I was already scheming to take advantage of her somehow. From that conversation on, Louise started watching me differently. When I would discuss farm business with Daddy, she would ask detailed questions about finances and decisions that had never interested her before. When Daddy and I would work on repairs or improvements, she would want to know how much everything cost and why those particular choices were being made. She started talking to Daddy about making sure everything was properly documented and legally clear for the future. She brought up the idea of getting the land appraised, of having formal agreements about how decisions would be made, of protecting everyone's interests in writing. Daddy just wanted peace in his family. He was getting older. His health was not what it used to be, and the last thing he wanted was conflict between his children. So he started making promises to Louise, trying to reassure her that everything would be handled fairly, that nobody would be taken advantage of, that family would always come first. But I could see that Louise was no longer sure she could trust family to come first. Something had changed in her heart, and I did not know how to change it back. Daddy passed away on a Tuesday morning in October of 1988. He went peacefully in his sleep, which Mama said was a blessing, but I have never found anything peaceful about losing the man who taught you everything you know about being decent in this world. The funeral was everything Daddy would have wanted. First Baptist Church was packed with people whose lives he had touched over 73 years. The pastor talked about Daddy's faith, his work ethic, and his devotion to family. Louise and I sat on either side of Mama, holding her hands while neighbors and friends shared memories of a man who had never said an unkind word about anybody. For those few days after the funeral, it felt like we were a family again. Louise stayed at the house with Mama and me, helping with the endless stream of visitors and casseroles. We sorted through Daddy's belongings together, sharing stories and crying over old photographs. When people asked about the future of the farm, Louise would nod along as I explained that I would keep working the land just like Daddy had always wanted. I thought we had found our way back to each other. I thought grief had reminded us what really mattered. I was wrong. 3 weeks after we buried Daddy, Louise came to the house with a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one of those city lawyers from Baton Rouge who wore expensive suits and carried briefcases that cost more than most people made in a month. His name was Richard Thibodeau, and he had the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Marcus," Louise said, standing in the kitchen where we had eaten breakfast together for the first 18 years of her life, "we need to talk about Daddy's will." I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where Daddy used to read his Bible every morning, and listened while this stranger explained why my sister thought I was a thief. According to Mr. Thibodeau, the will was not as clear as everyone had assumed. Yes, the land was left to both Louise and me in equal shares. But there were questions about some recent changes Daddy had made, additions that gave me more control over day-to-day decisions than Louise thought was fair. "Your father made several modifications to his will in the months before his death," the lawyer said, spreading papers across Mama's kitchen table like he was dealing cards. "Modifications that significantly benefit Marcus while limiting Louise's ability to have input on important decisions about the property." I stared at those papers, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. "What modifications? Daddy never said anything to me about changing his will." That was when Louise spoke up, and her voice was colder than I had ever heard it. "That is exactly the problem, Marcus. Daddy was sick and grieving after Mama died, and somehow these changes got made without the rest of the family knowing about them. Wait, our Mama had died 6 months before Daddy, after a stroke that came out of nowhere and took her from us in less than a week. During those awful months when Daddy was trying to figure out how to live without the woman he had loved for 48 years, I had spent every free moment I had making sure he was not alone, making sure he was eating, making sure the farm was still running. Louise had come home for Mama's funeral and stayed for a week. Then she went back to Baton Rouge, back to her job and her friends and her new life. She called every Sunday and visited once a month, but the day-to-day care of a grieving widower had fallen to me. "Louise, you know I would never take advantage of Daddy," I said. "If he made changes to his will, he had his reasons. Maybe he talked to his own lawyer about making sure the farm would be properly taken care of. Or maybe," she said, looking me straight in the eye, "he was confused and sad, and you were the only one around to influence his decisions." Those words hit me like a physical blow. My baby sister, the girl I had protected and cared for and loved my entire life, was accusing me of manipulating our dying father for personal gain. "Louise Marie, how can you say that?" I asked. "How can you think I would do such a thing?" "Because the numbers do not add up, Marcus. Because suddenly you have decision-making power that gives you control over property worth more than $250,000. Because you were the one handling all of Daddy's business in those last months. And now you are the one who benefits from changes none of us knew were being made." Mr. Thibodeau cleared his throat and started talking about legal options. He used words like undue influence and diminished capacity and equitable distribution. He talked about challenging the will, about protecting Louise's interests, about making sure justice was served. I sat there listening to a stranger discuss my father's mental state like he was a piece of evidence in a case file, and I felt something break inside my chest that I do not think has ever fully healed. "What exactly are you asking for?" I finally said. Louise folded her hands on the table, and for just a moment she looked like the little girl who used to ask me to read her bedtime stories. Then her jaw set in a way that reminded me of Daddy when he had made up his mind about something. "I want the will contested. I want an equal voice in all decisions about the property. And if you cannot agree to that, then I want the land sold and the proceeds divided fairly." Sell the land. Sell the place where 4 generations of Delaney's had lived and worked and raised their children. Sell the peach trees Mama had planted, the fields Daddy had plowed, the house where Louise and I had learned to walk. "I cannot do that," I said. "I will not do that." "Then you will be hearing from our lawyer," Louise said, standing up and smoothing down her dress. "I had hoped we could work this out as family, but I can see that you have already made your choice." She walked toward the door, then turned back one more time. "You know, Marcus, I used to think you were the most honest man I knew. I used to be proud to tell people you were my big brother. But taking advantage of a sick old man? That is not the Marcus I grew up with. That is somebody I do not know at all." And then she was gone, leaving me sitting at that kitchen table with papers I did not understand and a pain in my chest that felt like it might kill me. 2 weeks later, I got the official notice. Louise Marie Delaney versus Marcus James Delaney. My sister was taking me to court. The trial lasted 3 days, but it felt like 3 years. Walking into that courthouse in St. Francisville was like walking into a nightmare where everything familiar had been turned upside down. I had never needed a lawyer before in my life, never had cause to distrust anyone enough to put agreements in writing or worry about people twisting my words against me. But there I was, sitting next to a court-appointed attorney who barely looked old enough to shave, watching my sister's expensive lawyer tear apart everything I thought I knew about truth and family. The courtroom was not large, but it felt enormous with empty space between Louise and me. She sat at the plaintiff's table in a navy blue dress I had never seen before, her hair styled in a way that made her look older and harder than the girl I remembered. She did not look at me when I walked in. She did not look at me during the entire first day. Her lawyer painted a picture of me that I did not recognize. In his version of the story, I was a manipulative older brother who had spent months working on a sick, grieving father, slowly convincing him to change his will in ways that would benefit me at his daughter's expense. He talked about how I had isolated Daddy from other family members, how I had been the only one present when the will changes were made, how convenient it was that these modifications gave me exactly the kind of control over the property that I had always wanted. He brought in witnesses I had never met, legal experts who talked about patterns of undue influence and the vulnerability of elderly people dealing with grief. He made it sound like I was some kind of predator who had been planning this for years. When it was my turn to testify, I told the truth. I told them about the nights I had sat with Daddy after Mama died, listening to him cry and helping him figure out how to cook meals for himself. I told them about the mornings I had found him standing in the peach orchard, talking to Mama like she was still there. I told them about the conversations we had about the future of the farm, about his worry that the land might be lost if it was not properly managed. I explained that Daddy had always known I would be the one to take care of the property. It was not something we had to discuss or plan. It was just understood, the way it had been understood in his father's time and his grandfather's time. The will changes were not about cutting Louise out. They were about making sure the farm stayed in the family and stayed productive. Did you ever discuss these will changes with your sister? Louise's lawyer asked me. No, I had to admit. Daddy said he would handle talking to Louise when the time was right. But that time never came, did it? Your father died without ever explaining these changes to his daughter. That is right. So as far as Louise knew, she was inheriting equal ownership with equal say in all decisions? I suppose so. And you never thought to mention that this was not actually the case? I looked across the courtroom at Louise, hoping to see some sign of the sister who used to trust me completely. But her face was like stone. I thought she knew, I said. I thought she understood. The worst moment came on the second day, when Louise took the stand. She talked about feeling excluded from important family decisions in the months before Daddy died. She talked about phone calls that seemed to end abruptly when she asked about the farm's finances. She talked about visiting and finding me and Daddy deep in conversations that would stop when she walked into the room. I started to feel like a stranger in my own family's business, she said, like decisions were being made without me, and I was expected to just accept whatever Marcus thought was best. Her lawyer asked her about the discovery of the will changes. I felt sick, Louise said. I realized that while I was grieving and trying to deal with losing both my parents, my brother was making sure he got everything he wanted. I felt like such a fool for trusting him. Then came the question I had been dreading. Louise, do you believe your brother deliberately took advantage of your father's grief to manipulate these will changes? She was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked directly at me for the first time since this whole nightmare began. Yes, she said, I do. That word hung in the air between us like a door slamming shut. Yes. She believed I was a thief and a liar and the kind of man who would cheat his own family. When my lawyer cross-examined her, he asked about our childhood, about the relationship we had always had, about whether I had ever given her reason to distrust me before this. No, Louise admitted. Marcus was always honest with me growing up. He was a good brother. But you believe he changed? You believe he became the kind of person who would deceive you and take advantage of your father? Louise's voice got very quiet. People change, she said. Sometimes they change in ways that disappoint you. The judge deliberated for less than an hour. He ruled that the will was valid, that there was no evidence of undue influence, and that the changes Daddy had made were within his rights as the property owner. He said that grief and family dynamics were complicated things, but that did not make legally executed documents invalid. I should have felt relieved. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt empty. Louise stood up when the judge finished reading his decision. She gathered her papers and her purse and walked toward the courtroom door without looking back. I caught up with her in the hallway. Louise, wait, I said. She stopped and turned around. Her eyes were red, but she was not crying. What, Marcus? What do you want to say now? I want to say that I am sorry this happened. I am sorry you felt left out. I am sorry Daddy did not explain things better. But I am not sorry for taking care of our family's land the way he raised me to do. She stared at me for a long moment. You know what, Marcus? I am not sorry either, because now I know exactly who you really are, and I am glad I found out before it was too late. Louise, please, we are still family, we are still brother and sister. No, she said, shaking her head. We are not. Family does not do what you did to me. Family does not lie and scheme and then act innocent when they get caught. She walked away then, and I let her go. There was nothing left to say. The girl who had followed me everywhere, who had trusted me with her secrets and her fears, who had saved half her dessert for me and held my hand during thunderstorms, was gone. In her place was a stranger who looked like Louise but believed I was capable of things that would have broken our parents' hearts. 20 years have passed since that day in the courthouse. I have never spoken to my sister again. The silence that followed our courtroom battle was not the kind of quiet that comes with peace. It was the heavy, pressing silence that comes when something vital has been cut out of your life, leaving a space that never quite heals over. For the first few months after the trial, I kept expecting Louise to call. I thought maybe once the anger cooled down and the lawyers went away, we might find a way to talk like reasonable adults. I thought she might realize that family was more important than hurt feelings and wounded pride. I was wrong about that too. The first Christmas without her was the hardest. I had always been the one to pick out her presents, wrapping them in the funny paper she liked with the dancing reindeer. That December, I caught myself looking at things in the store and thinking she would like them, before I remembered that Louise was not going to be at our Christmas table anymore. I set the table for 2 that year instead of 3. Just me and the empty chair that had been Mama's. Louise's chair stayed pushed under the table, and I found myself avoiding looking at that side of the room. The holidays got easier after that, but only because I stopped trying to celebrate them the way we used to. Christmas became just another day. Birthdays came and went without phone calls. Thanksgiving turned into a quiet meal for one, watching football games I did not care about just to fill the silence. The hardest part was not the big occasions, though. It was the small moments when I would see something that reminded me of her, or when something would happen that I wanted to share with the person who had known me longest in this world. When old Mrs. Henderson down the road passed away, I found myself reaching for the phone to call Louise before I remembered that she was not someone I could call anymore. When the peach trees had their best harvest in 10 years, I wanted to tell her about it because she was the only person who would understand why that mattered. I learned to live with the quiet, but I never learned to like it. The farm kept me busy, which was probably a blessing. Every morning I would walk the property line, checking fences and counting cattle, making sure everything was the way Daddy would have wanted it. The land did not care about family fights or hurt feelings. It just needed tending, season after season, year after year. I took pride in that work. By the time Louise and I might have been talking again, if we had been the kind of people who could work past our differences, the farm was more productive than it had ever been. The peach orchard was expanding. The cattle operation was profitable. The old farmhouse had a new roof and fresh paint. Sometimes I would imagine showing Louise around, pointing out improvements and talking about plans for the future. But those were just daydreams, and I learned to push them away when they came. Church helped some. First Baptist had been our family's spiritual home for 3 generations, and the folks there knew better than to ask about Louise after the first few years. They would include her in prayers for traveling family members, and I would sit in the pew where we used to worship together, listening to the pastor ask God to bless her wherever she was. I never knew where she was exactly. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had moved away from Baton Rouge, maybe to Texas or Arkansas. Someone said they thought she had gotten married, but they were not sure. Another person mentioned seeing her at a family reunion on her mother-in-law's side, but that was second-hand information that might not have been reliable. The not knowing was almost worse than the silence. At least when you are not speaking to someone, you can imagine they are doing well, living a good life, maybe even thinking about you once in a while. But when you do not even know where someone is or what name they might be using, they become like a ghost of themselves. I dated some over the years. There was a widow named Carol who attended my church, and we went to dinner a few times and shared some pleasant conversations. There was a woman named Patricia who worked at the bank in St. Francisville, and we saw each other on and off for almost 2 years. Both of them were good women who deserved better than a man who was still carrying around hurt from an old family fight. The problem was not that I could not care about other people. The problem was that there was always this empty space where Louise should have been, and it colored everything else in my life. How do you explain to someone you are dating that you have a sister you have not spoken to in 15 years? How do you talk about family gatherings when half your family is missing? I became the kind of man who was pleasant enough but kept his own counsel. Folks in town knew me as reliable and fair dealing, but not as someone who shared much about his personal business. I worked hard, paid my bills on time, helped neighbors when they needed it, and kept my troubles to myself. The farm became my refuge and my identity. When people asked about my family, I would talk about my parents and their legacy, about the history of our land, about the responsibility of taking care of something that had been passed down through generations. I learned to tell the story of my life without mentioning Louise at all, but she was always there in the spaces between words, in the pause before I answered questions about siblings, in the way I would flinch when someone mentioned family reunions or holiday gatherings, in the careful way I steered conversations away from certain topics that might require me to explain why my sister was not part of my life. 20 years is a long time to carry around hurt. Long enough for anger to fade into sadness and sadness to settle into acceptance. I thought I had made peace with the way things were. I thought I had built a life that was complete without Louise in it. I thought the story was over, and all that remained was to tend the land and grow old with dignity and maybe find some kind of meaning in the quiet years I had left. Then she came back, and everything I thought I knew about endings turned out to be wrong. Learning to live without Louise was like learning to walk again after losing a leg. You figure out how to get where you need to go, but the balance is never quite the same. You adapt, you manage, you find ways to make it work, but there is always that sense of something missing. By the 10th year after our trial, I had developed what you might call a routine for living alone. I woke up at 5:30 every morning, made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and ate breakfast while listening to the farm report on the radio. I would spend the early hours checking on the cattle and tending to whatever needed attention around the property. Afternoons were for paperwork, repairs, or trips into town for supplies. Evenings were the hardest time, when the work was done and the sun was setting over land that felt too big for one person. That is when I would find myself remembering things I thought I had put behind me. The sound of Louise's laugh echoing across the fields. The way she used to help Mama with canning, standing on that old wooden stool with her tongue poking out in concentration. I tried to fill those quiet hours with purpose. I started reading more, working my way through books I had always meant to get to. I taught myself basic carpentry and built new shelves for the living room, a better chicken coop, a bench for the front porch where I could sit and watch the seasons change. The church became more important to me during those years. Not just for Sunday worship, but for the sense of community it provided. I started helping with maintenance projects, volunteering for the annual church supper, even teaching Sunday school for the younger children. It felt good to be useful, to be someone people could count on. I made friends of a sort. There was Tom Bradley, who owned the farm next to ours and would come by sometimes to discuss cattle prices or weather patterns. We would sit on the porch with glasses of sweet tea and talk about everything except the things that really mattered. There was Emma Watson from church, a schoolteacher who had never married and understood something about building a life around work and faith instead of family. These were good people who made my days a little less lonely. But friendship is different when you are holding part of yourself back, when there are whole sections of your story that you cannot share without opening wounds that have barely healed. I got to where I could talk about my parents easily enough. People loved hearing stories about Daddy's wisdom and Mama's cooking, about the way things used to be done on small family farms. But whenever someone would ask about other family, about whether I had brothers or sisters, I would feel that familiar tightness in my chest. "I have a sister," I would say, "but we do not stay in touch anymore." And then I would change the subject before anyone could ask why. The truth was, I thought about Louise more than I wanted to admit. Not every day, but often enough that I began to understand what people meant when they talked about carrying someone with you wherever you go. She was part of the landscape of my memory, woven into every corner of the farm in ways I could not erase even if I had wanted to. I would be fixing a fence, and remember the summer she helped me repair the same section, complaining the whole time about getting her hands dirty, but working alongside me until the job was done. I would be picking peaches and see her face in every tree Mama had planted. Remember the way she used to climb higher than she should have, fearless and laughing while I worried she would fall? Sometimes I would catch myself wondering what she was doing with her life. Had she found happiness after leaving Louisiana? Did she have children who looked like her or like the rest of us Delaney's? Did she ever think about the farm, about the family that had shaped her before whatever happened in Baton Rouge changed the way she saw the world? There were moments, usually late at night, when I was feeling particularly sorry for myself, when I would consider trying to find her. I could have hired someone to track her down, could have written a letter care of her last known address, could have swallowed my pride and made the first move toward some kind of reconciliation. But every time I got close to taking that step, I would remember her face in the courthouse hallway, the way she had looked at me like I was a stranger she did not care to know better, the coldness in her voice when she said we were not family anymore. Some hurts go too deep for apologies to reach. Some words cannot be taken back, no matter how much time passes or how much you might regret the circumstances that led to them being spoken. So I learned to live with the questions instead of seeking answers. I made peace with not knowing whether Louise was happy or sad, successful or struggling, surrounded by new family or as alone as I sometimes felt. I told myself that she had made her choice when she walked out of that courthouse, and I had made mine when I let her go without fighting for her to stay. The farm prospered during those years of quiet. The cattle operation expanded. The peach orchard became known throughout the parish for producing some of the finest fruit in Louisiana. I modernized where it made sense, but kept the essential character of the place intact. This was still the land Daddy had worked, still the home Mama had made beautiful with her flowers and vegetables. I took pride in being a good steward of what had been entrusted to me. Whatever else Louise might think about the choices I had made, she could not say I had failed to take care of our family's legacy. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the weight of solitude pressed down harder than usual, I sometimes wondered if legacy was worth much when you had no one left to share it with. I was 57 years old and had built a life that was productive and peaceful and entirely my own. I thought that was enough. I thought I had figured out how to be content with what I had, instead of mourning what I had lost. Then Louise came back and I learned the difference between acceptance and healing. It was a Tuesday evening in late September, and I was sitting on the front porch watching the sunset over the peach orchard. The harvest was finished. The trees were starting to show their first hints of autumn color, and there was that particular quality to the light that only comes in Louisiana when summer finally starts loosening its grip on the land. I had just finished a glass of sweet tea and was thinking about heading inside to make some supper when I saw a car coming up the long gravel drive. That was unusual enough to get my attention. Most folks who had business with me called ahead, and it was getting late in the day for casual visits. The car was a small sedan, white and clean but showing its age. It moved slowly up the drive, like whoever was driving was not entirely sure they were in the right place. When it reached the circle in front of the house, it stopped for a long moment before the engine shut off. I stood up from my chair and walked to the edge of the porch, trying to see who was behind the wheel. The driver's side door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was thin, thinner than seemed healthy, and her hair was shorter and grayer than I remembered. But even 20 years later, even changed by time and whatever life had brought her, I knew that face. It was Louise. She stood beside her car for a moment, looking up at the house like she was seeing it for the first time. Her eyes moved from the new roof I had put on 5 years ago, to the fresh paint on the shutters, to the bench I had built where Mama's old rocking chair used to sit. She looked older, more fragile than the woman who had walked out of that courthouse, but there was something else too, something that looked almost like fear. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying across the space between us like it had crossed 20 years of silence. I do not know what I expected her first words to be if I ever saw her again. An apology, maybe. An explanation. Some acknowledgement of all the time that had passed and all the hurt that lay between us, but "Hello, Marcus" was what I got, spoken in a voice that sounded like she was afraid I might not recognize her. "Louise," I said back. Because what else do you say to a ghost who suddenly becomes real again? She took a few steps toward the porch, then stopped. Her hands were shaking slightly, though whether from nerves or something else, I could not tell. I was not sure you would still be living here, she said. Where else would I be? I do not know. I guess I thought maybe you would have moved on by now. Sold the place, started over somewhere else. I almost laughed at that, but there was nothing funny about the situation. This is my home, Louise. It has always been my home. She nodded, looking around at the familiar landscape like she was trying to reconcile her memories with what she was seeing now. It looks good, the farm, I mean. It looks like you have taken good care of it. I have tried. We stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. Two people who used to know each other better than anyone else in the world, now struggling to find words for a conversation that should never have been necessary. Louise looked different in ways that went beyond age and weight loss. There was a carefulness about her movements, a way of holding herself that suggested pain she was trying not to show. Her clothes were neat but plain, nothing like the stylish outfits she used to wear when she lived in Baton Rouge. Her wedding ring finger was bare, though there was a pale band of skin that suggested she had worn one recently. Marcus, I need to talk to you, she said finally. I know I do not have any right to ask, but could I come inside? Just for a few minutes? Part of me wanted to say no. Part of me wanted to remind her of all the years she had been gone, all the silence, all the words she had spoken that could not be taken back. But another part of me, the part that remembered the little girl who used to follow me everywhere, could not bring myself to turn her away. All right, I said. Come on up. She climbed the porch steps slowly, like each one was an effort. When she reached the top, she paused again, looking at the door she had walked through thousands of times as a child and young woman. Thank you, she said quietly. I led her inside to the living room, the same room where we used to do homework at the big oak table, where Mama would read to us on winter evenings, where the family would gather after Sunday dinner to listen to Daddy play his harmonica. Louise sat down carefully in one of the armchairs, the same chair she had always preferred when we were growing up. I took the couch, putting the coffee table between us like a safe distance that neither one of us was ready to cross. You want some tea? Coffee? I asked, falling back on the basic courtesy Mama had drilled into us. Tea would be nice, she said, if it is not too much trouble. I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, using the time to steady myself and try to process what was happening. Louise was in my house. After 20 years of silence, my sister was sitting in our living room, looking around at the place she had once called home. When I came back with 2 glasses of sweet tea, she was studying the photographs on the mantelpiece. Pictures of Mama and Daddy, old family gatherings, even a few from when we were children that I had never had the heart to put away. I am glad you kept those, she said, accepting her glass with hands that were definitely shaking now. They are part of the history of this place. She sipped her tea and seemed to gather herself for whatever had brought her here. Marcus, I know this is awkward. I know I am probably the last person you expected to see today. But I am here because I need your help, and you are the only person in the world who can give it to me. Something cold settled in my stomach. What kind of help? Louise set down her glass and looked me directly in the eyes for the first time since she had arrived. I am sick, Marcus, very sick, and the doctors tell me there is only one thing that might save my life. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire you cannot put out. Louise sat in that familiar chair, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her, and waited for me to respond to something I was not prepared to hear. What kind of sick? I asked, though part of me already knew this conversation was heading somewhere I did not want to go. Louise took another sip of her tea, and I could see her hands trembling as she lifted the glass. My kidneys are failing, have been for the past 3 years. The doctors tried everything they could think of, but nothing worked. I have been on dialysis for 18 months now, and it is not enough anymore. I knew a little about kidney failure. Tom Bradley's wife had gone through something similar a few years back before she passed away. It was not a good way to live, and it was not a good way to die. I am sorry to hear that, I said, and I meant it. Whatever had happened between Louise and me, I did not wish that kind of suffering on anyone, especially not someone I had once loved more than my own life. The doctors have been looking for a donor match, she continued. They tested everyone they could think of. My husband before we divorced, my stepchildren, even some friends who volunteered, but nobody was compatible. She paused, staring down at her hands. Then they suggested testing family members. Blood relatives have the best chance of being a match. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. Louise, what exactly are you asking me? She looked up at me then, and for just a moment I saw the scared little girl who used to run to me during thunderstorms. I need a kidney, Marcus, and you are the only blood family I have left who could possibly be a match. There it was. 20 years of silence, and she came back because she needed something from me. Not because she missed me, not because she regretted the things that had been said, not because she wanted to make peace. She came back because I might have something inside my body that could save her life. The irony was not lost on me. The sister who had accused me of taking what did not belong to me was now asking me to give her something that literally came from inside me. Have you been tested? I asked. Do you know if we are compatible? Not yet. They would need to do blood work, tissue typing, a whole series of tests. But the genetic counselor said siblings have about a 25% chance of being a perfect match, and even if we are not perfect, there might be ways to work around minor incompatibilities. 25%. Those were not great odds, but they were better than what she had been working with up to now. I sat back on the couch, trying to process what she was asking. Kidney donation was serious business. I would have to go through extensive medical testing, psychological evaluation, surgery, weeks of recovery. There would be risks, both immediate and long-term, and there was no guarantee it would work. How long do you have? I asked. If you do not find a donor, I mean. Louise's voice got very quiet. The doctors say maybe 6 months, maybe less. 6 months. My sister, who I had not spoken to in 20 years, had maybe 6 months to live unless someone gave her a kidney. Unless I gave her a kidney? The silence stretched between us while I tried to wrap my mind around the situation. Here was Louise, looking older and sicker than I had ever seen her, asking me to literally give her part of myself to keep her alive. The same Louise who had called me a thief and a liar in front of a judge. The same Louise who had walked away from me like I was nothing more than a stranger she had no interest in knowing. Marcus, she said finally, I know I do not have any right to ask this of you. I know what happened between us, and I know the things I said. I know I hurt you, and I know I threw away 20 years of being brother and sister over things that probably do not matter much anymore. She stopped and took a shaky breath. But I am asking anyway, because I do not have anywhere else to turn. The doctors have exhausted every other option. You are my only hope. I looked at her sitting there in Mama's chair, and for a moment I could see both versions of Louise at the same time. The scared, sick woman asking for help, and the angry, suspicious woman who had torn our family apart with lawyers and accusations. Why now? I asked. Why did you wait until you were dying to come back here? Louise was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Pride, I suppose. Stubbornness. The same things that made me think I was right 20 years ago when I probably was not. She looked around the room, at the pictures on the mantel, at the furniture that had not changed much since we were children. I told myself I was doing fine without family. I got married, moved to Arkansas, started a new life. I told myself I did not need the farm, or the memories, or the brother who had disappointed me so badly. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. But when the doctor started talking about how much time I had left and I started thinking about dying alone in some hospital room with nobody there who remembered me as a child, I realized maybe I had been wrong about some things. What things? Maybe I was wrong about what happened with Daddy's will. Maybe I was wrong to think the worst of you instead of trying to understand your side of things. Maybe I was wrong to throw away 20 years of being your sister over a piece of land that is going to outlast both of us anyway. She looked at me with eyes that seemed older than her years. I am not asking you to forgive me, Marcus. I am not even asking you to forget what I did. I am just asking you to help me live long enough to maybe figure out how to make some of this right. I sat there looking at my sister, this woman who had been the most important person in my world for the first 25 years of my life, and tried to figure out how to feel about what she was asking me to do. After Louise left that evening, promising to call in a few days to hear my answer, I sat on the front porch until well past midnight, staring out at land that had been in our family for 4 generations, and trying to make sense of the choice I was facing. On one hand, it seemed simple. Someone was dying, and I might be able to save them. That person happened to be my sister, despite 20 years of silence and hurt feelings. Christian charity alone would suggest that helping her was the right thing to do. On the other hand, nothing about Louise and me had ever been simple. I kept thinking about the way she had looked sitting in that courtroom, her face cold and determined as she told a judge that I was a thief. I remembered the lawyer she had brought to tear apart everything I thought I knew about family loyalty and trust. I remembered her walking away from me in that courthouse hallway, telling me we were not brother and sister anymore. For 20 years I had lived with those memories. 20 years of empty chairs at Christmas dinner, of birthday cards I wrote but never sent, of wondering where she was and whether she ever thought about the family she had walked away from. Now she was back, not because she had missed me, but because she needed something from me. Something that would require me to undergo surgery, to take medical risks, to put my own health on the line for someone who had spent 2 decades acting like I did not exist. The practical side of my mind started running through all the reasons to say no. I was 57 years old, not a young man anymore. Surgery always carried risks, especially for someone my age. What if something went wrong? What if I had complications? Who would take care of the farm if I was laid up for weeks or months recovering? And even if everything went perfectly, there was no guarantee that Louise would survive the transplant. People died during surgery all the time. People rejected donated organs. People lived for a few months or years and then died anyway, leaving the donor to wonder if the sacrifice had been worth it. But the more I tried to talk myself out of it, the more I kept hearing Mama's voice in my head. Ruth Elizabeth Delaney had been the kindest person I ever knew, but she had also been firm about certain things. Family was family, she used to say. Blood was blood. You did not turn your back on people who shared your name and your history, no matter what foolish things they might have done. I could imagine exactly what Mama would say if she were still alive, and I told her Louise needed help. She would give me that look she used to give when I was being stubborn about something obvious, and she would say, "Marcus James, that girl is your sister. She is the only sister you will ever have. You help her, and you do not think twice about it." But Mama had not been there in that courtroom. Mama had not heard the things Louise said about me, had not seen the way she looked at me like I was a stranger she despised. Mama had died believing that her children would always take care of each other, no matter what. I walked out to the family cemetery that night, to the spot where Mama and Daddy were buried side by side under the old oak tree they had planted on their wedding day. Their headstones were simple granite markers with their names and dates and a Bible verse about love never failing. "I do not know what to do," I said out loud to the darkness and the crickets and whatever part of my parents might still be listening. "I do not know how to be the man you raised me to be, and also protect myself from being hurt again." The night did not answer back, but standing there in the quiet, I started thinking about what kind of person I had become over the past 20 years. I had been a good steward of the land, a faithful member of my church, a reliable neighbor and friend. I had built a life that was productive and peaceful and entirely my own. But had I become the kind of man who could watch his sister die when he had the power to save her? Had hurt feelings and wounded pride turned me into someone who would choose revenge over mercy? The truth was, part of me wanted Louise to suffer a little. Part of me wanted her to understand what it felt like to need someone who might not be there for you. Part of me thought it would be poetic justice if the sister who had abandoned her family ended up paying the ultimate price for that choice. But another part of me, the part that remembered holding her hand during thunderstorms and teaching her to fish in the pond behind the barn, could not bear the thought of her dying alone in some hospital room, knowing I could have prevented it. I thought about forgiveness and what it actually meant. The pastor at First Baptist preached about it regularly, about how Jesus commanded us to forgive our enemies, to love those who had wronged us, to turn the other cheek when we were hurt. It sounded good in theory, but it was a lot harder when the person who had wronged you was sitting in your living room asking for a kidney. Was giving Louise one of my kidneys an act of forgiveness? Or would it just be letting her off the hook for 20 years of choosing pride over family? And what if she got better? What if the transplant worked and she lived for another 20 years? Would she stick around this time, or would she disappear again once she got what she needed from me? Would saving her life mean opening myself up to being hurt all over again? I stayed out there in the cemetery until the sun started coming up, wrestling with questions that did not have easy answers. By the time I walked back to the house, I still did not know what I was going to tell Louise when she called. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever choice I made, I would have to live with it for the rest of my life. And so would she, however long that might be. The question was not really whether I could save Louise's life. The question was whether I could live with myself if I did not try. Louise called 3 days later, just as she had promised. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when the phone rang, and I knew before I answered it that it would be her. We had not talked about when she would call or what time, but somehow I had been expecting it all morning. "Hello, Marcus," she said, and I could hear the nervousness in her voice. "I hope I am not calling too early." "No, it is fine. I have been up for a while." There was a pause, and I could almost feel her gathering courage on the other end of the line. "Have you had time to think about what we discussed?" I had thought about little else for 3 days. I had prayed about it, wrestled with it, lost sleep over it. I had imagined the conversation we were having right now a dozen different ways with a dozen different answers. "Yes," I said. "I have thought about it." And I took a deep breath and said the words that I knew would change both our lives forever. "I will do it, Louise. I will get tested to see if I am a match." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if the call had been dropped. Then I heard something that sounded like crying, though Louise was trying to muffle it. "Thank you," she whispered finally. "Marcus, I cannot tell you what this means to me." "It does not mean we are even," I said, because I needed her to understand that clearly. "It does not mean I have forgotten the last 20 years, or that we are suddenly going to be close again like nothing happened. I know that. And it does not mean I am doing this because I think you deserve it. I am doing it because it is the right thing to do, and because I can live with giving you a chance, but I could not live with letting you die when I might be able to prevent it. I understand. Do you? Because I need you to understand that this is not about you and me being brother and sister again. This is about me being able to look at myself in the mirror and know that I did what a decent person would do when someone needed help." There was another pause, and when Louise spoke again, her voice was steadier. "You are a better man than I gave you credit for, Marcus. A better man than I deserved 20 years ago, and a better man than I deserve now." I did not know what to say to that, so I moved on to practical matters. "What do we need to do? How does this work?" Louise had obviously been prepared for this question. She gave me the name and number of her doctor in Little Rock, explained the testing process, told me what I should expect. It would take several appointments spread out over a few weeks to determine if I was compatible. Blood work, tissue typing, psychological evaluation, meetings with social workers and surgeons. "The doctor said if you are a match, the surgery could be scheduled within a month or 2, she said. "But Marcus, if the tests show you are not compatible, or if you change your mind at any point, I will understand. I will not blame you or be angry or anything like that. I'm not going to change my mind. How can you be so sure?" I thought about that question. How could I be sure about anything when it came to Louise and me? We had a history of hurting each other, of making assumptions that turned out to be wrong, of letting pride and stubbornness damage something that should have been unbreakable. "Because I have had 3 days to think of every reason not to do this," I said finally. "I thought about the things you said in that courtroom. I thought about 20 years of silence, I thought about the fact that you only came back here because you needed something from me. Marcus, let me finish. I thought about all of that, and I thought about what kind of man I want to be when this is all over. And the kind of man I want to be is the kind who helps his sister when she is dying, even if she has not been much of a sister to him. Louise was quiet for a moment. I was not much of a sister to you, was I? No, you were not. I am sorry for that. I know it does not change anything, and I know it is 20 years too late, but I am sorry. It was the first time she had actually apologized for what had happened between us. Not for getting sick, not for asking for help, but for the choices she had made that had torn our family apart. Thank you, I said. That means something. Will you be able to come to Little Rock next week for the initial testing? I looked around the kitchen where we had eaten breakfast together as children, where Mama had taught us both to cook, where the four of us had planned family trips and discussed the day's work and said grace before every meal. Yes, I can be there next week. We made the arrangements, exchanged phone numbers, agreed on when and where to meet. The conversation was businesslike, practical, focused on medical procedures and logistics. But underneath all the details, something had shifted between us. It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was not reconciliation or restored trust or any kind of return to the way things used to be. But it was recognition, maybe. Recognition that whatever had happened in the past, whatever mistakes we had both made, we were still connected by something deeper than hurt feelings and legal disputes. Before we hung up, Louise said one more thing. Marcus, whatever happens with the testing, whatever happens with the surgery, if it comes to that, I want you to know that I am grateful. Not just for this, but for the way you turned out. Mama and Daddy would be proud of the man you became. After I hung up the phone, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, drinking coffee that had gone cold and thinking about choices and consequences in the strange way life sometimes gives you a chance to find out who you really are. In a few days, I would drive to Little Rock and let doctors stick needles in my arm and run tests to see if my blood and tissue were compatible with Louise's. In a few weeks, I might be lying on an operating table, letting surgeons remove one of my kidneys to give to the sister who had called me a thief 20 years ago. I still did not know if it would work. I still did not know if Louise and I would ever be able to rebuild any kind of relationship. I still did not know if I was being wise or foolish. But I knew I had made the right choice. And for now, that was enough. The surgery happened in early spring. The air was cool the morning they wheeled me into that bright operating room, and I remember thinking how strange it felt to be putting my life in the hands of strangers so that my sister could have a chance at keeping hers. When I woke up afterward, the first thing I noticed was the ache, deep and steady, where the doctors had taken the kidney. The second thing I noticed was the quiet. Hospitals have a way of making you feel small, like the whole world has been narrowed down to the space between your bed rails. Louise was in another room down the hall. I didn't see her for 2 days while the nurses kept us both under close watch. When they finally let me visit, I walked in slow, holding onto the IV stand like an old man leaning on a cane. She was sitting up in bed, pale but with more color in her face than I'd seen since she showed up at my porch. She smiled when she saw me, not wide, not like the girl I remembered from the orchard, but soft, genuine. "You look tired," she said. I sat down in the chair beside her bed. "You don't look half bad yourself." For a long moment, we just sat there in silence, listening to the beeping of her monitors. Then she reached over and put her hand on mine. "Thank you, Marcus. I know I've said it before, but I mean it more than you'll ever know." I didn't have an answer for that. So I just squeezed her hand, and we stayed that way until the nurse came in to check her vitals. We both went home eventually, me to the farm, her to a small apartment near her doctor's. Recovery wasn't easy. There were days my body reminded me just how much it had given up, days I wondered if I'd been foolish to take the risk. But there was also a strange peace in knowing that I'd done what I believed was right, even if it had cost me something. Louise and I talk now, though not often. There's no rushing 20 years of silence into something it isn't, but there's an open line between us, A Christmas card in the mail, a phone call on birthdays, sometimes a short visit when she's feeling strong enough to travel. It's not perfect. It's not what it was. But it's something. And maybe that's the point. Forgiveness isn't about erasing what happened. It's not about pretending the hurt wasn't real or that the betrayal didn't cut deep. Forgiveness is about deciding who you're going to be when the choice is in your hands. It's about refusing to let bitterness make your decisions for you. I didn't give my sister a kidney because she deserved it. I gave it because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. Because when all is said and done, I'd rather be the man who gave than the man who turned his back. Some of you listening might be carrying something. An old wound, a family rift, a betrayal that still keeps you awake some nights. I'm not here to tell you to get over it. I'm not here to say that forgiveness is easy or that reconciliation is always possible. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes people don't change, and sometimes the wisest thing you can do is keep your distance. But here's what I will say. When life puts you in a position to choose, that choice will tell you more about yourself than it will about them. And you'll have to live with that choice for the rest of your days. So ask yourself, not what they deserve, but who you want to be. Sometimes, you give not because they earned it, but because it frees you. And maybe, just maybe, it frees them too.